Today we are going to talk about the overview of FDI in 2020. FDI trends have been affected by two important factors recently. Trade wars between US and China, which is a part of protectionism in the recent years. The other important factor has been COVID crisis. And I do believe that the second factor has been really more important on the trends of FDI. Today we are going to study the impacts of these two factors and then provide some policy implications, actionable implications for the policymakers. We are going to talk about how governments are going to deal with this issue, how we can solve these two problems and come back to try to go back to the normal situation. So let's start with the importance of globalization. Globalization is really important for poor countries. Access to the global market is really critical for them. Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, usually mentions Bangladesh as a motivating example. This country is still poor, but it also has 3 times income per capita that it used to have. And it's all because of being able to export its products, mostly clothing, to the international market. They're selling their products recently to the international market, and they could increase their GDP per capita dramatically. Therefore, globalization is really important for these countries. And I understand that many people all around the world are criticizing globalization because it is increasing the inequality in the societies. But we will come back to this point at the end of this session and talk about this issue. Trump's protectionism has been harming this trend of globalization recently, and it has been one of the factors actually, but it is the most famous one. We have seen the impact of that on the trade diversion and shift in FDI. In the face of higher tariffs resulting from the trade war between China and the US, importers have already sought new sourcing locations in the global marketplace. Trade diversion may in turn cause a shift in FDI as firms adjust global supply chains and centers of production. An unprecedented decline in global FDI flow. We are in a critical time. A period of economic uncertainty marked by the COVID-19 outbreak is changing the patterns of international production and corporate decision-making. We can summarize the impacts of the COVID crisis in a challenging global policy environment, disruptions in supply chain, and declines in revenues. Even before the COVID crisis, as I already mentioned, global FDI was in decline due to the trade policy uncertainties, rising protectionism, falling in the rates of return on FDI, and changing forms of international production. In our lecture, we focus on a report by the World Bank Group, Global Investment Competitiveness Report. Our recommendations in this lecture is based on this report. This is a survey of more than 2,400 business executives representing FDI in 10 large developing countries, including Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, Thailand, Turkey, and Vietnam. This survey proves that policy uncertainty due to the protectionism and economic nationalism has made have two factors. First, decrease in employment, firm productivity, or investment. And then the surveyed executives also mentioned that they have no intention of expanding their investment over the next 3 years. According to this survey, top 3 investment decision factors are supportive political environments, stable macroeconomic conditions, and conducive regulatory regimes. Foreign investors said in this survey that supportive political environments, stable macroeconomic conditions are the factors that are even more important than low taxes, low labor and input costs, or access to natural resources. So therefore, this is our first recommendation can also come from here. If we are facing the decline in FDI inflow in our country, the first thing that we need to consider is the risk in our country. Many policymakers think that decreasing the tax can be a motivating factor that can increase the flow of FDI to the country. But the point is that if the risk is high, in your country, even if you decrease the tax to 0, you cannot attract any FDI. I always mention Afghanistan and Iraq or Syria in my classes, and I mention them as an example that the governments of these countries, even if they decrease the tax level to 0, anyway, again, some investors are reluctant to invest in those countries because the level of risk is really high in these countries. Okay, another thing that we understand from this report is that FDI in developing countries yield benefits to firms and citizens, including more and better paid jobs, technology transfers, and a stronger linkage to global value chain. But the technology transfer and creating jobs, I need to mention that job generation by technology depends on the nature of the technology. If the technology is in the form of automation, it is replaced, the labor work is replaced by that automation, and it can increase the unemployment rate in our country. But on the other hand, if the form of technology is task creation, it can create new jobs in our country and decrease the level of unemployment. Pre-COVID-19 global environment. So we divide the history by 2 in this lecture. The affecting factors before COVID crisis and the other factors that happened after COVID crisis. Actually, we should say during the COVID crisis, because that crisis has not ended yet. We are in the middle of it. The pre-COVID crisis global environment for FDI. We need to consider it. The factors that affected the economy during this period was rapidly eroding investor confidence because of trade and investment uncertainty, lagging global growth, falling commodity prices, and rising protectionism. These are the factors that affected trends of FDI before COVID crisis. This figure shows FDI inflows to developing countries over the past decade. Part A shows a stock of FDI net inflows in the dollar value of FDI. and part B shows GDP share of FDI. And as you can see, after 2016, this trend has decreased. The red line shows the FDI inflow in the whole world. The green line shows it in high-income countries, and you can see the decline, the dramatic decline after 2016. The same trend in the GDP share of FDI in the economies. Here I added a note, if I can show you, yes, about the sample that this figure is based on all countries. These are the developing countries, are all of the middle income and the low income countries. Factors of worrisome global trend in recent years are three factors: economic factors, business factors, and policy factors. Economic factors include decrease in rate of return on investment from 8% in 2010 to 6.8% recently, and also the rise of advanced manufacturing technologies. These manufacturing technologies are those automation technologies that I already mentioned that can replace the workforce and decrease the unemployment rate. The policy factors include erosion of investor confidence due to policy uncertainty and change in US tax policy that drove repatriation of capital, back to the US. Actually, before Trump's government, the high level of US tax made the investors go out of the United States, take their capital out of the US, and invest it in the other countries. But during we witnessed the US tax cut in the Trump's government, and it made the capital out of the US come back to the US. The source of new rise in trade and investment policy uncertainty. We define four sources here. And this withdrawal from global trade agreements, which means previously there are some global trade agreement between the countries, and recently some countries decided to come out of those agreements. Tariff escalation, that Trump's trade war was a part of that. Trade tensions, and also more restrictive rules on the entry of FDI. We will talk about these restrictive rules in detail later. The main reasons behind decreasing restrictive rules on FDI inflows. Why countries are willing to put restriction on FDI inflows to their countries? First reason is anti-globalization sentiment, a rise in economic nationalism, and finally growing protectionist views. About anti-globalization sentiment, which we have seen in all around the world that many people are against globalization because they believe that it increases the inequality in the society. But we need to pay attention that inequality in the society is not coming from the globalization. The problem is not globalization. The problem is inefficient taxation rules. If you look at the countries with high level of inequality, you can see that in those countries, the taxation system is not working well. So when we have high level of inequality in the country, it doesn't mean that we can shut down the globalization. We know from Econ 101 that output is a function of capital and labor, and rate of return on capital gives us the economic growth. And therefore, the person who has the capital will be rich and richer day by day. It's a normal thing. But it doesn't mean that we should shut down the investment and FDI inflows to our country because of to prevent the inequality. We can have our economic growth, we can attract investment, we can have our economic growth, but at the same time, by a little bit of Robin Hoodism, we can fix the problem of inequality. We get the money from the rich people as a tax and spend it on the education, healthcare, and child nutrition. And therefore, in the long run, we will have an educated, healthy adult who ends up paying more tax. Therefore, this is what I think about globalization. And those people who think globalization is not a good thing should consider these basic economic rules. Okay, the concerns of governments and enacting strict screening of foreign acquisitions. What is the reason behind it? The first reason is perceived risks to national and economic security. The second reason is potentially non-commercial objectives of foreign investment by state-owned enterprises. The other reason is foreign ownership of core technologies, manufacturing of health products, healthcare products, sensitive business assets, and critical infrastructure. This figure shows investment policies regarding FDI. The dark blue is the rules restricting FDI, and the other line, the top line, shows the rules in favor of FDI inflows. And as you can see, after 2016, the restrictive FDI rules has increased, and on the other hand, the FDI rules that are in the favor of FDI inflow has decreased. The sample, this sample is based on 2018 data, comprised 55 countries that undertook at least 112 FDI-related policy measures. Okay, we said that even before COVID crisis, investors were sensitive to policy uncertainty in trade and investment. So in this survey by World Bank Group, they asked two questions from the business executives. First, how important was rising policy uncertainty in your investment decisions? 35% of the managers said that it has been important. 29% of them said that it has been critically important in their investment decisions. So they asked from those 29%, they asked a second question. And what was that second question? This is the second question. What impact has rising policy uncertainty had on your company's operation in this country? 51% of these people mentioned at least one factor, affected by policy uncertainty. 31% said that their business experienced decrease in jobs. 34% mentioned decrease in productivity in their business. And finally, 35% of them reported decrease in the level of investment. Okay, until here, we talked about the impacts of policy uncertainty and other factors before COVID crisis. Now we are going to talk about COVID crisis, the uncertainties due to COVID-19. What has affected companies' operations across the globe? First, closing the factories, disruptions in the transportation, unavailability of production inputs, decline in supply chain reliability, spread of shock from directly hit sectors to others, demand fall due to precautionary behavior of consumers, and declining investment activity. Okay, so we are already familiar with all of these issues. So let's talk about the business part. In this survey, which is the data has been collected in April 2020, they asked 2 questions from their business executives. And I am trying to somehow change this screen to see that. Okay. Okay, they asked 2 questions. One of them about the recent impacts on their business, the other one about their expected impact. One question is, over the last 3 months between January till March 2020, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on your company? 80% of the companies reported on average 40% decrease in net income. Again, 80% of those companies reported on average 38% decrease in their revenue. And finally, 39% of the companies reported on average 16% unemployment. Then they were asked about their expectations for the next 3 months between April and June 2020. They were asked, what is the likely impact of COVID-19 on your company? So 86% of the companies are expecting 46% decrease in their income. 69% of the companies are expecting 42% decrease in investments. And finally, 62% of the companies are expecting 25% decrease in employment. So all of these problems made the policymakers to regulate some new rules very suddenly. So what are these regulatory changes? First, nationalization of essential supply chains. Obviously, because of the lockdowns, the closed borders, and problems in the transportations, many multinational firms could not import the raw material, so they decided to nationalize their supply chains. Then the next change was cancellation of government procurement contracts. And the other change was exchange control restrictions. And what are these government procurements? Uh, these are the purchase of goods and services on behalf of the public authority to prevent fraud, waste, corruption, or local protections. What is exchange control restrictions? Actually, exchange controls are government-imposed limitations on the purchase or sale of currencies. These controls allowed countries to better stabilize their economies by limiting inflow or outflow of the currency. Okay, so till now we talked about the problems for FDI trends. Now we want to talk about how can FDI help economies to survive from this problem. First of all, FDI can provide critical source of external capital for financing public debt, creating more and better paid jobs, lifting people out of poverty, and boosting productivity. We know that many governments all around the world decided to give loans to small businesses during the COVID crisis. They decided to give loans to small businesses to keep their employees on the payroll. In addition, many governments decided to pay COVID-related unemployment benefits. And all of these issues, in addition to increase in public debt, may cause many problems for them. Of course, the increase in the public debt is not a problem for advanced economies like the US or the UK, but in developing countries, according to debt overhang hypothesis, the high level of public debt can make really important problems in the long run, and it can retard the growth of the economy. Therefore, FDI can be a financial resource to take care of this public debt. In addition, we know that many businesses during the lockdowns faced bankruptcy and unemployment. We are facing the explosion of unemployment in most of the countries. So if FDI can provide a job for the people in our country, it can increase the average income of the family and decrease the level of poverty in the country. That's why we are talking about the impact of FDI on welfare. We also mentioned here that beyond capital, foreign investment also helps creating jobs and reducing the poverty. FDI can affect welfare through three main channels. And what are those main channels? First channel is income to employees, prices for consumers, and income to producers. About employment income, as FDI brings capital and new technology to a sector, it often raises overall labor demand and productivity in the sector, and it can rise the total employment and average wages. About consumer prices, actually the entrance of foreign firms to the market, to the local market, increases the competition between the firms, and at the same time it increases the productivity. So therefore we may see the decrease in the prices and at the same time increase in the purchasing power of the consumer. So the consumers will be better off. About producer income, as foreign firms compete with our domestic firms, or they also may buy some raw material from our domestic firms, they may influence the productivity and profitability of these domestic firms. So they may also increase the income of these producers. Okay, now we are going to compare the performance of multinational enterprises and local firms. And we know that we have two forms of FDI, greenfield FDI and brownfield FDI. When a foreign company comes to our country and starts the business from the beginning, it is greenfield investment. But when they buy a local firm, a domestic firm, it is named brownfield investment. The acquisition of a domestic firm is brownfield investment. Brownfield FDI firms perform better than local firms on some of the key dimensions that matter for employment. Okay, now we want to study these key dimensions one by one. These dimensions are export orientation, product diversification, asset accumulation, labor productivity, and employment. So let's compare the performance of the firms in these aspects. The first figure. These figures are compare the performance of foreign firms and local firms. Those two blue lines show the performance of foreign firms, and the yellow line shows the performance of domestic firms. In part A, that shows the wage growth, we can see that foreign firms are much better than domestic firms. Also in labor productivity, foreign firms are better than domestic firms. The labor productivity in foreign firms are around 2 times more than domestic firms. Part C shows the employment. As you can see, both greenfield and brownfield MNEs are performing much better than domestic firms in employing people, in employing domestic people. In terms of multiple product offering, they are almost the same. And these two figures show the exports and imports of, compares the exports and imports of these companies. In terms of exports, greenfield multinational enterprises are much better than the others. They are also, the foreign firms are also higher than domestic firms in terms of imports. Previously, we talked about the impact of FDI on the balance of payments. And we said that if the foreign firm imports a lot to produce in our country, it can harm the balance of payment of in our country. But in long run, of course, they can produce goods and services and export it, and then improve the balance of payment. Okay, I wanted to talk about the sample here. The sample of these countries were collected from China, Indonesia, Moldova, Serbia, and Vietnam. Okay. Until here, we talked about the problems. And now we need to offer some solutions. If you have a look at the literature, there are lots of papers that talk about the impact of FDI on the economic growth, on economic development, and many of them detected a positive impact of FDI on economic growth, and at the end, in the policy maker, in the policy implication, if they have a policy implication, they just say that, so therefore the governments should try to boost the FDI inflow. But they don't mention how the governments exactly are supposed to boost the inflow of FDI. The answer to this question is different for different economic situations. And of course, after these two crises, first trade wars and COVID crisis, the situation has changed a lot. And so we should look for the answer to this question in the current situation. So in this lecture, we are going to answer this question based on the current situation. So first, the main objectives should be to enhance investor confidence, maximize investments contribution to inclusive growth, and finally, foster the investment competitiveness of their economies. This is what the governments need to do. So in the next slides, we talk about how exactly the governments are supposed to achieve these objectives. First of all, responsible fiscal and monetary policies can underpin macroeconomic stability. Then better regulation and implementation would reduce obstacles to investments. And then we have commitment to market access and rules-based international system. It can decrease uncertainty related to protectionism and economic nationalism. The other factor is that governments can further reduce risk and build confidence by implementing transparent and predictable regulatory regimes. Also, we need to pay attention that measures to improve labor market skills and local supplier linkages to multinational companies can promote more equitable economic growth. How can government rebuild investor confidence? The COVID-19 pandemic has rapidly escalated business uncertainty, in turn magnifying investment risk and depressing foreign investment confidence. Multinational firms are responding to changes in policy environments. Some of them are changing their corporate strategies and reassessing their approaches to sourcing their raw material. And they are also diversifying their suppliers and also making greater use of digital technologies. Therefore, the government can improve this situation by first reducing investor risk, improving policy predictability, improving the regulatory certainty, and then targeted investment promotion. When we talk about risk, the most important thing is that how to measure the risk. There are different criteria to measure the risk. When we measure the risk, we can talk about how to manage it. 3 dimensions of countries' regulatory frameworks for investment. We consider 3 dimensions. What are those 3 dimensions of regulatory risk. First one is transparency, protection, and resource. So we always talk about transparency. Transparency is very important when we want to attract the investors to our country. The regulations should be transparent. And we should also have some frameworks to explain the rules for them, explain the regulations of investment in our country. We also may have some regulations to protect, for protection of the investments, to protect their rights for investing in our country. Higher regulatory risk is associated with lower FDI inflows. We talk about it in a moment. The effect of regulatory risk on FDI exceeds that of trade openness. So it means that even if you have trade openness, if you have low tariffs, but you have high risk in your country, there is no hope for attracting the FDI. So these two graphs shows how FDI is changing by risk. These two regressions shows that FDI net inflows is decreasing by increasing the risk. The uncertainty, the policy uncertainty can increase the FDI inflows in our country. So about the sample, I think I added a note here. No, I didn't. I forgot to add a note, but this is the same sample that they used for the same sample of developing countries that they used for the other analysis. Okay, the importance of legal and regulatory environments. The critical importance of regulatory environment is further confirmed by results from this report, 2019 Global Investment Competitiveness Survey, in which investors rank countries' legal and regulatory investments as one of the top 3 factors for investment. 84% of respondents list regulatory environment as an important or critically important factor in their investment decisions. When it comes to the investors who consider these factors critically important, the legal and regulatory conditions for the host countries rank behind only political and macroeconomic stability. So let's see this ranking. This is the ranking. The important factors for decision making. The most important one is political stability. Around 50% said it is critically important. 35% mentioned it is important for them. Macroeconomic stability, 50%, around 50% said that it is critically important. 36% said it is important. And the third factor is the factor that we are talking about, legal and regulatory investment. 42% mentioned it is critically important, and 42.1% mentioned it is important. Okay, how can government, we said, till here we said that risk is a bad thing, and we studied how risk can decrease the inflow of FDI to the country. So how the government can reduce risk? Remaining committed to creating open and predictable environments for FDI. Then actions at both international and domestic levels. Decreasing policy uncertainty by using three factors. First, international commitment to market access, rules-based international systems, and finally, multilateral frameworks on investment facilitation. We have talked a lot about investment facilitation and how they can improve the inflow of FDI by decreasing the risk for investment. So let's discuss it a bit here. According to Berger et al. 2019, as a new route to global investment governance, this framework is for improving the transparency and predictability of investment frameworks, streamlining procedures related to foreign investors, enhancing coordination and cooperation between stakeholders such as host and home country governments, foreign investors, and domestic corporations. Okay, how can governments leverage FDI for robust recovery from COVID crisis? What can governments do on one hand to leverage FDI to strengthen the resilience of their economies and help absorb future stocks? Helps to absorb the shocks in the economy. And on the other hand, to turn the current COVID crisis into new opportunities to increase their competitiveness for FDI. To avoid protectionist policies, first, there are three factors. First, easing FDI entry and operational restrictions, then enhance regional cooperation, and then bilateral and regional trade and investment agreements. Countries can seize new opportunities to increase their competitiveness for FDI as a result of shifting trade and investment patterns and policies. In the face of higher tariffs resulting from US-China trade war, importers have already sought new sourcing locations in global marketplace. Trade diversion may in turn cause a shift in FDI as firms adjust global supply chains and centers of production. Developing economies with large export base could emerge as suitable FDI hosts, specifically countries that already export similar products are likely to attract greater investment. And finally, the third, so we studied three factors: avoiding for recovery from using FDI. How can we use FDI for recovery from COVID crisis? The first factor was avoiding protectionist policies, seizing new opportunities, and then finally, strengthening global cooperation. Tackling the complex challenges presented by current global environment will require global cooperation. The pandemic has illustrated the shared public health and economic vulnerabilities that countries face. It has also highlighted the critical importance of exchanging data, sharing information on good practices, and strengthening collaboration. Okay, so that's all. I tried to describe the problem first and then provide some solution. I hope you enjoyed. If there is any question, I am here to answer. Okay, I think there is no question. So, Svetlana, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so what is our agenda for the rest?
So the audience, maybe you have some questions, please?
Is there any question?
No, sorry, Professor. I have a question.
Yes.
You said and wrote in presentation that rules with FDI one second, become more hardly at the beginning. What does it mean?
Could you say your question again?
1 second, I formulate my question and ask after.
Okay, no problem. Any other questions?
Amin,
Yes.
let's look through the chat. Maybe some questions there.
I am looking at it. I don't see any questions here. Russell is asking for his certificate. And nothing else.
The question from Gorelenko Alexander.
Okay.
In the chat.
I have a question.
Yes. Excuse me, Professor Kazi. Let me answer this question first, then I come to your question. Which one was more harmful, Trump's trade war or COVID? Definitely COVID has been more important because in Trump's trade war, just some small countries were affected. But for example, even the US that started this war was not affected that much because they banned import of the goods from the China, and at the same time, their importers import their goods from Bangladesh and Vietnam. But in the COVID crisis, all of the world is facing a hard problem, and the point is that we don't have shock absorber. The point is that in the other crises, we have a shock absorber, which is decreasing the interest rate. But in the case of this crisis, we don't even have any shock absorber. The interest rates have been low for a long time in Europe and in Japan. In Japan, the interest rates are negative, so there is nothing that we can do. That's why we all, the economists always say that there is no shock absorber. So definitely, to answer your question, definitely, COVID crisis is more challenging. I hope I could answer your question. Professor Kazi, I am here to hear your question.
Okay, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I enjoyed.
Thank you. Thank you.
So my question is, so you try to stress that due to the COVID and trade war, try to reorient the FDI scenario. So some country maybe have some benefit and some country are losing. So in the context of Russia, I mean, which side, what is the stand of Russia, whether Russia has any opportunity to grab any kind of, in terms of the FDI, or Russia is going to lose from these two phenomena?
Okay, I think overall, the whole economy is collapsing, not collapsing, is retarded. We are facing the retarding the economic growth in the whole economy, and FDI as well, the risk has increased. But in terms of specifically in Russia, definitely those uncertainties, policy uncertainties that we talked about is also included in Russia. I think Russia is also included negatively, is affected negatively from the risk and policy uncertainty. What is your opinion?
Okay, no, and my point is, let's say, because of the trade war, particularly on China.
Yeah.
So whether the Russia has any opportunity to grab some share of market, at least small fraction, let's say, that the Russia can utilize to have a new industry,
yeah,
instead of China.
Yes, the winners of trade war, I think the winners of trade war were those Asian economies with cheap labors, Vietnam and Bangladesh, or maybe Taiwan. But I don't think any country sees Russia as a cheap labor economy. And I think Asian economies are the winners of trade war. In the case of COVID crisis, everyone is loser. But in the winners of trade war are those Asian economies with cheap labor. And I don't think Russia is between those countries.
Amin, one more
Yes.
question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more question from Dementiev Felix. See in the chat, please.
You have mentioned that. Yes, tightening the rules for FDI. Actually, tightening the rules for FDI means the governments doesn't have a good point of view about FDI inflow. And they try to restrict the FDI inflows. And we also talked about the main reasons that the governments are trying to restrict it. First of all is anti-globalization point of view. The other thing is national security issues. National security issues, and sometimes the foreign firms are trying to enter to a country and get the fundamental parts of the country, like health and military parts of the country, which is really risky for the host country. So in these cases, governments, the host country governments try to restrict FDI. And recently, I also mentioned that it is not just about restriction. We can also talk about the monitoring the FDI. And the first one, maybe it has a negative impact, but the second one, monitoring, I always said that monitoring FDI is a good thing. And it can increase the quality of FDI inflow to our country, and it leads to attract more FDI with more rate of return on investment. I hope I could answer your question.
Okay, thank you. Now more clear. Thank you for
Thank you.
answer.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
My question, I mean, I want to know your opinion about India, because I can say that labor is cheaper than that of the China or other part of world in India, and Indian government is trying to has already taken an initiative named Make in India, and they are trying to invite all business and FDIs in India. Even government is trying to open its market for the foreign investment. So what do you see India in this whole scenario?
Okay, again, in terms of protectionism, India is an emerging economy with almost cheap labor. So in terms of protectionism, India can be a winner, because at some points if the countries are banned, if there is another trade war and the countries are restricted by importing the inputs from China, they can import some of them from India, as they are already importing from Bangladesh and Vietnam. So in terms of protectionism, India can be a winner. And of course, it depends on how open the India is to the FDI market. But in terms of COVID crisis, India, you know that COVID crisis is kind of catastrophe in India, and it is very risky. So investors are really reluctant to start new investments in India and expand their investment. So in the first case, in the protectionism, I think India has advantage, but in the COVID crisis, I think it's a catastrophe for India.
Actually, I want to know that what is the India in this trade war? If we don't talk about the COVID crisis, then people say I mean it's observation that trade war between America and China.
Yeah.
What is the stand of India? How you see this one?
Yes. And the point is, when there is a trade war between two main important countries like the US and China, the patterns of investment will change. So investors will try to invest in another countries. Previously, for example, Apple is producing, many electronic companies are producing in China because of low labor costs. But when there is trade barriers, when there is protectionism, the governments are looking for alternatives, but it is not always easy because China has some potentials in industry. For example, in electronic industry, they can produce laptop, but maybe India is not good enough. You don't have enough technology to produce laptop, for example. So if the United States, if the firms in the United States want to come to India from China, they need to bring the technology with themselves to India. So they need to have a cost-benefit analysis in this case, whether it is worthwhile for them or not. So it needs empirical studies, I think. Okay, any other questions?
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So my question is, how much it is important to have a stable currency with stable exchange rate for FDI?
It is very important because as a foreign investor, when I want to come to your country, I need to exchange. I need to exchange the currency. For example, I have dollar. I want to invest in Russia. I need to change my money to ruble. So if ruble is cheap, if the exchange rate between US dollar and ruble is high, as it is high, so it is more worthwhile for me to come to Russia and invest in Russia. So when the value of the currency, the domestic currency is low, it is more worthwhile to come to that country and invest in that country. Another issue that we need to consider is that production, when I come to your country and produce goods and services in your country and decide to export from your country, it appreciates the value of your currency. And this appreciation can decrease the level of export of your country. So there is kind of trade war between them. So again, when I want to come to your country, the low value of domestic currency is helpful. But when I export, when I produce goods and services and export from your country, it appreciates the value of your currency, and it may have a negative impact on the export level of your country.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I think there is no questions. Let me see the chats. There's no questions. Svetlana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amin. So if you have no questions, so I would like to say thank you to the lecturer, Dr. Amin Sokhanvar. Thank you very much for your attention, for your good information and lecture. Oh, one question. No, we have no any question. We have no any question.
Okay.
So, and of course, I would like to say thank you to our audience. Thank you very much. And remind you that you can invite all other our events. See the link in the chat. Our events of International Marathon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.